There we go. All right. Good to see you all today. So, there we go. So you may notice I have turned on captions, which should be coming through in German, but maybe you have to activate them on your end. We may have someone joining us today, or a few people joining us today from Germany who don't speak great English, but I noticed that Zoom allows a real-time translation. Ashton and I had an article published in Das Gertianum in English a couple months ago, and they just published the German version, and so there's some more interest over in Germany in what we're up to here. So today I'm going to briefly summarize the last 10 pages or so of Chapter 4 and the first couple of pages of Chapter 5, which is about knowledge of higher worlds concerning initiation. So, Steiner ends Chapter 4 by discussing the growing physicalization, let's say, of the human being. Ahriman is growing more powerful in this post-Atlantean period of Earth evolution, not just in the life between birth and death, but particularly in the afterlife. Ahriman is veiling our connection, the human being's connection to the spiritual world more and more as you go through the ancient Indian, Persian, Egyptian, and Greek civilizations. And this is appropriate because the mission of the human being on the earth, right, is to, Steiner says, gain mastery over the physical world, which after the Saturn, Sun, and Moon phases of evolution is, what the human being is being called to engage most with during this planetary epoch. Steiner goes through the ways in which, for the ancient Indians, there wasn't as much disconnection yet from the spiritual world, but that increased with the ancient Persian peoples, and they had this really important initiate, Zarathustra or Zoroaster, who helped them remember that the spirits of light are behind the physical sense world, that the physical sense world is just the outer appearance of this deeper spiritual reality. But Ahriman was working all along the while there to convince human beings that the physical sense world is the only reality. And then after death, Ahriman was working to isolate the human being and to make us more self-centered, right? And as we would experience this Ahrimanic veiling in the afterlife, those who couldn't remember, couldn't see through that veil would reincarnate as egoists and be more and more cut off from others and from the spiritual world. During the Egyptian period, Steiner talks about Hermes again, who helped the ancient Egyptians prepare to meet the light spirit after death. But there was, at this point, really a increasing falling away from connection to the spiritual world. And then this falling away met its peak, as it were, with the Greeks, who were able to work with the sensory world and bring such beautiful forms into their architecture and sculpture, and that in the afterlife they would describe it just as the realm of shades, and really had no sense for the transformative process that happens between death and a new birth because of how intense this Ahrimanic veiling had become. But still, at this time, Steiner describes the mysteries nurturing the human being's connection to the spiritual world. There were initiates who were working and cultivating special states of soul that allowed them to see through the veils, both the veils that Ahriman is placing, blocking us from connection to the spiritual world behind the physical world, as well as the veils that Lucifer is holding up in the astral. And Steiner describes two different forms of initiation or two ways of ascent. There's one that lifts the Ahrimanic veil, allowing initiates to behold the divine creative powers that were at work in the Saturn, Sun, and Moon phases of evolution, along with the inner spiritual work underlying the physical, etheric, and astral bodies, and the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms that correspond with them. And then there's this other form of initiation that lifts the Luciferic veils, allowing initiates to behold the nature of and the hierarchies at work in the sentient soul, the intellectual soul, and the spiritual or consciousness soul. And that some of these initiates removing the Luciferic veil could also gain a kind of prophetic anticipation of the coming of the Christ, that they had some recognition of the possibility of the future, when a human being would have an astral body that was properly prepared enough to allow the light beings of the sun to incarnate into a human body, and that through the etheric body perceive the nature of the sun truly. And this, of course, would be the incarnation of Christ, and that after this occurs, after the Christ event, Steiner says that physical death can alter nothing in this human being's life. I want to come back to that. What changes after the incarnation? Steiner talks about Moses briefly as an initiate both into the Western Asiatic and the African or Egyptian mysteries, and so Moses has both of these ways of ascent, right? He has been shown what's behind both the Ahrimanic veil and the Luciferic veil. Steiner talks about the shift in the nature of the mysteries after the incarnation. After the end of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch or period, the Greco-Latin or Greco-Roman, we've sort of reached the culmination of this physicalization process. And so the nature of the mysteries and what the initiates are trying to bring to the human being and human communities changes. Steiner says that since the Christ event, the human beings who lift themselves to the mystery of Golgotha are able to, after death, carry with them into the spiritual world what has been gained in the sense world. And then from the spiritual world, this insight, this Christ impulse, then flows back again as human beings reincarnate. And we bring with us back to earth what the Christ impulse reveals to us in the after-death state, right? And so there's a continual sort of reseeding of the earth with this Christ impulse as human beings reincarnate. And there's a ripening of this Christ seed. And Steiner says at this point that we are but at the beginning of Christian evolution, which is a quite, I think for many people today, a counterintuitive thought, because here we are 2,000 years after the Christ event. Many people would think, oh, this is an old traditional religion that's no longer relevant. And Steiner says, actually, it's just beginning. And we might want to distinguish between the religion that forms and the churches that form around this event from the impulse itself, right? Which I think they're related, obviously, but there's something distinct there. And it may be that nowadays many of the existing churches are not the clearest representatives or best pathway to experience the Christ impulse. And actually, in this context, when Steiner's talking about after the Christ event, the way in which the reincarnation, human beings are continually reseeding the earth with what's revealed in the after-death state by the Christ impulse, I couldn't help but think of something this guy, Whitehead, says. It's the very last paragraph of Process and Reality, where he's talking about the relationship between God and the world. And I won't go too into depth here, but he's talking about this fourth creative phase of the relationship between God and the world that I couldn't help but feel was deeply resonant with what Steiner is describing here after the Christ event, where Whitehead says, what is done in the world, in the physical sense world, is transformed into a reality in heaven, and the reality in heaven passes back into the world. By reason of this reciprocal relation, the love in the world passes into the love in heaven and floods back again into the world. In this sense, God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. So again, it's like the last paragraph of Process and Reality, and it really feels like Whitehead is intuiting something in his own way that Steiner is describing here. We can talk more about that if you all are interested. Steiner also says at this point that as the Christ impulse continues to ripen in human individuals and communities, that race, the differentiation and separation of humans into races, going back to the Lemurian time, is overcome. And that this universal human ideal can be restored, Steiner says, through the feeling that the inmost self of man has in everyone the same origin. And then he describes Europe, which takes over in this fifth post-Atlantean period from the Greco-Roman, Greco-Latin cultures, as having a peculiar state of soul that still had this dim clairvoyance from the Atlantean times, and that Europe had been isolated enough to not be influenced by the development of these four prior cultural epochs and civilizations. And so there's this dim clairvoyance that's been preserved, manifest in fairy stories and sagas and so on. And also this peculiar form of intellect and a mastery of the sensory world through this intellectual capacity. And so that the European soul is sort of dual, right? Has this feeling capacity, this heart-centered capacity to really emotionally resonate with the Christ event and the Christ impulse, but not the intellectual capacity to understand it. That intellect, the European intellect, is more focused on mastery of the sensory world. And Steiner describes how we see this coming through in our present time. I mean, he was speaking about a century ago in the conflict between science and religion, but that the sixth post-Atlantean period is already taking root in our time, and that would lead to possible reconciliation between these two dual parts of the European soul. But I found it interesting here how we've talked in other sessions before we got into occult science about what Steiner says about the future, and he describes Asia as sort of also having this kind of dim clairvoyance that's atavistic in a way, and that needs to be preserved for a time until the sixth epoch, when there's the opportune moment for what Europe has developed to then meet what has been preserved in Asia. And I heard him describing Europe in this context as the fifth epoch in a similar way, that something has been preserved here, and so it put what he says about the future and the role of the East in a different context for me. And then briefly in chapter 5, we only got a few pages into it this week, Steiner talks about the process of initiation and coming to develop this state of consciousness that's it's somewhere between waking and sleeping, where he talks about our senses becoming inactive, and that we won't even, when we're cultivating this state, we won't even have a memory of their action. But we're trying to awaken a kind of spiritual organ of perception whereby we could become fully awake without the support of the sensory world. Steiner says that his own knowledge of these prior epochs of planetary evolution comes as a result of cultivating these states of soul or conditions of consciousness. And he gives a few warnings. He talks about how for some people for whom these organs have become inwardly ripe, a kind of self-initiation can occur spontaneously. But even in those who are especially ripe, these exercises that Steiner is going to introduce us to can be helpful. He warns against spiritual pride. And he points out that one can become an initiate, developing these states of soul in a way that wouldn't directly affect or influence normal life, right? There's no direct connection here, but there is an indirect connection, he says, because those who lack a kind of ethical stability or good feeling may become ill as a result of the insights pouring in from these special states of soul. It would be like somebody who's during waking life constantly entering the dream state. It would throw things all off balance, and so we have to be careful as we engage with this work to not forget ethical and basic ethical practices and compassion and a sense of goodwill, because the knowledge that can come through these special states of soul can lead us astray. And then he says that these changes which occur as a result of initiation have nothing to do with human physiology. So I'll stop there and invite us to discuss this very interesting material. Max, please.
Yes, thank you, Matt, for the summary. I thought I would just pick up on some of the picture that Shanna raised in the very beginning of the chapter 5 in respect to achieving a state where we are we are having perceptions that are not occasioned by sensory stimulus or by sensory percepts, but rather non-sensory percepts. And this possibility that Steiner has laid before us was called to mind yesterday as I was walking, and I walked past a blind man who was, with a stick, seeing his way feelingly with the stick, and I remembered a book that I read, one of the great biographies that I've read by somebody who was actually an anthroposopher as well, that I didn't find out until after I read the book, and then I was in a certain way not surprised just because of the kind of attitude and spirit that he demonstrated throughout the whole thing. Then his name is Jacques Lucéren. He was a part of the French resistance during World War II, and the book that I have in mind is called "And There Was Light." But he went blind also at a very young age, and he described something that, ordinarily, I think in a naive way, I would imagine that a blind person just simply doesn't see. But that's not a very good way to understand what's happening, at least based on the testimony of this book and also reading Helen Keller's biography. My impression is they see just like we do. It's just that our vision is mostly, it's the same. So in our vision, we are doing something that's comparable to what we're doing in dreams. Only what we're doing, in other words, imagining a coherent surroundings and environment. In our dreams, it's unconstrained by sensory inputs, whereas when we're awake, it's constrained by the sensory inputs. Now, I just imagine for a blind person, the constraints are different. The way they're seeing is constrained not by visual input, but definitely by auditory input and tactile input and so on. And then I was, further imagining how it would be, for instance, to see like a dog. In other words, you would be navigating through fields, basically, of like olfactory fields. And then it started to create a bridge for me to better understand and better apprehend what Steiner would be indicating as like a capacity that can be developed to be receiving these non-sensory percepts and seeing, again, doing the same thing that we're doing in ordinary seeing, but constrained not by visual input, but rather by input that's coming from the other side, so to speak, outside of the senses.
Yeah, I found it striking that he says that to develop this clairvoyant perception or cognition, that we need to free ourselves not only of sense experience, but even the memory of it, so that we're not just rearranging prior sense experiences, but pulling on spiritual perceptions only. Angus, please.
Good morning, good evening, all. Good to see you. Thanks for that great resume there, or summary of at the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5 there, Matt. You so many interesting points you brought up. I'm only going to pick a couple of them, and if the conversation runs dry, I've got a whole list of slight things we can look at. Wanted to add some thoughts around a statement you made, not negating what you said, but like just describing it from another perspective. You talked about the post-Atlantean epoch to be to be considered as the period in which we should gain mastery of the physical world. Now, I'm not negating that, but I'd just like to see it from another angle, which actually links into an incomplete statement I made last week, because I think I said something along the lines of alcohol is for strengthening eye consciousness. Whereas what I really should have said is alcohol is that by which we live more deeply into matter, which then has the effect of increased self-consciousness or eye consciousness. And that's actually related to this part, the statement that you made there, that whilst it's true, it's like mastery could be seen, so from my perspective, more as a side effect of what's going on. The essence is for individual spiritual consciousness. And then the first means of attaining that becomes consciousness by having a spiritual body. So we become aware of ourselves in relation to the material world. So we recognize our separateness, but then that develops into, if we engage in spiritual practice, meditation, prayer, etc., then that will result in actual consciousness of the spiritual activity that lives in us. And that's where we're coming to with the consciousness soul epoch. That's my take on it. I'd love it if anyone's got anything they'd like to add to that, or perhaps even argue against what I'm saying. Another reflection. I'd love to go down Whitehead. That's deeply interesting what you said there, but we might come back to that. The other bit was about the process of initiation. Again, this is my understanding, and if somebody can say something contrary and serve up some evidence, I'm all ears. It's not that memory is possible if we've developed the conceptual clarity to understand what's going on, and this is deeply related to the whole knowledge of higher worlds path. What is implicitly stated, I said that incorrectly. What is stated many times in many lectures is that the preparatory path for becoming clairvoyant is the learning of the concepts of spiritual science. Because if we've really grasped them, then when they appear to us in this state, which I can understand why you would use the term between sleeping and it's like normal day consciousness, but I see it as a more elevated state. That when we're in that state, we are fully awake to initially the pictures that are unrolling before our eyes or presenting themselves, and we are awake to be able to recognize the conceptual truth that's hidden within those pictures. If we haven't got that conceptual truth that lives there, it will just disappear. It'll be like watching the TV without any memory. Ourselves having memory, it'll be one continuous flow of pictures and we'll never have a memory. But if the eye intervenes with the conceptual clarity that it's gained, then memory is indeed possible. Because otherwise, at least in my understanding, you can't explain how Steiner could ever come back with any of these truths. So that was a couple of my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. It has been my understanding that during these special states of soul, that the physical body appears as it would, the same as it would if someone were asleep, right? So the physical body is sort of just laying there, and there's this inward activity going on. Um, is that your picture as well as?
Um, if I more experience, if I go on here, it's you can be in a normal waking state, and suddenly you get a picture. It's like present itself before your eye, and it initially it's like a mystery. It's like, why am I receiving that picture now? And it's like, and in the context of it's like the situation that I am in, and so it's it's happening inside of me, and I'm linking it to the outer world. And it can also be with words, music, that type of thing. So we've got almost like a double awareness going on. I'm fully aware of the material world out there, but there's an inner voice, there's an inner reality that's communicating something to me. And with practice, you begin to sort what is like just a random memory and something that has something a bit deeper is going on in here. And then I'll need to like time and love to that, what I've received, to find the connection between that and what's actually occurring in this very moment. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I make a quick comment about the phenomenology of memory and this other state? I do think Angus makes a good point that it would be a mistake to compare it too closely to dreaming, but I think there is a similarity. And well, we all have that experience on waking in the morning of it's as though all the dreams are there, but they our ordinary experiences. It's as though they inscribe themselves in like a slate that actually keeps the impressions. Whereas during the dream state, it's as though our soul is fluid, and so the impressions, they don't inscribe themselves. And the only way to remember the dreams is to then think them over again in the waking state. And I think it's comparable to what Steiner's describing, where it's possible to remember, but in order to remember, you're going to have to do something different than you remember ordinary sensory impression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just I'm remembering Steiner says in another lecture about developing clairvoyance that his practice is to actually write while he's doing this to help him remember, and he doesn't go back and read it later. It's just the act of writing itself that allows for the meeting of the concept with what the spiritual perception is that grants this memory.
I could add something there, Matt. As an initial stage to sort of like moving towards that type of clairvoyance, I think anybody who maintains a dream journal or something like that, they're already entering into that process, exactly as Max was saying. We've got an inner life going on over which we have no conscious control. But when we wake up in the morning, something is there. Something has been created within us. And when we make that effort to remember, to write it down, we don't need to go back and remember these dreams, but we can still remember dreams from 20, 30 plus years ago because of that act of writing down. But if we don't, then it's disappeared.
Lorenzo, please.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm a little flashed because of all of what you said, because what I wanted to say links back to everything, but I had to start from a different point that I had in mind when I raised my hand. But I hope in the end you will see the connection. Last time, or a couple of times ago, I proposed this analogy, trying to explain the moments of reabsorption of pause in the creation process with this image of somebody who wants to create multi-layered music on a medium. I mean, transform this empty tape into a tape that contains a multi-layered music, and so lays one instrument, then rewinds the tape, lays another instrument, and I think there is some truth in this analogy. But at the same time, this raised an obvious problem, the problem of freedom. That is, okay, but if this tape is present all the time there, and you have already one layer, let's say, recorded up to the end of the tape, where is the freedom of the ego? And that this was also the problem that we found more generally in the book, because how can we synthesize Goethean epistemology or Goethean gnoseology with this tale of a far remote past where there still was no I, and so we have to imagine a world without freedom. And yeah, I was thinking about the oppository force, the contrary forces, about Lucifer and Ahriman and their role in this story. And I thought that, well, if there is if every individual has to be free, if you have to build the I, how would you do that? You would actually need something like a destiny already being there to be reacted upon, because the only way to create an organ is to also have something to be sensed, let's say. And so I thought, well, maybe it's the, let's call it destiny. It's the fact that there is a virtual future already built up to the end of time that begins reacting with each individual. And how does it react? It reacts retroactively, let's say. So it's a contrary motion, because it's like it's coming from the future towards us. So it's an enemy, let's say. It's it's contrary wise. And the first of these enemies is Lucifer, which is like the end of the universe is determined by you. The end, it's the, let's say, idealistic lack of balance that gives at the end of the universe, to the final result, a submissed hierarchical position in respect to the I. The I decides everything. And so Lucifer is this feedback between the end of the universe and the self. Then what happens? When many individuals have this Luciferic impulse inside of them, a secondary impulse also coming from the future, the far end of the universe appears. It's a second because it's like it was dimensionally orthogonal to the first. It is the presence of all these, let's say, little gods that are each determining the end of the universe. Then for you to be free imposes another kind of force that it's orderly, Ahriman, and that deals with the idea that the organization of a society is the only way to be free. And so it's once again feedback between the present and the distant future, but this time with another level of complexity. And all this building, the very contraposition of, and I think here is maybe where this links a little, at least with what was being said before, like the role of alcohol and the role of matter. And we can see that this this opposition between an already decided future that fits back with the present. It's the only way to build a freedom organ. And so I think we could say that we are seeing in the Luciferic and Ahrimanic influences the direct way in which the superior organs that we still have to be developed are being activated in us, just like the eye has been. Yeah, I hope it was kind of clear, and that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo, for following up on that that thought that you introduced with the tape earlier. I like the idea of a virtual future that's feeding back upon the present, that's not yet fixed, but clearly, I mean, destiny is a thing, but there needs to be some fluidity and flexibility there to preserve the possibility of freedom. Yeah. Karsten, please.
Yeah, I have two things. So first to Lorenzo, sometimes I feel like spending time with Lorenzo is like taking psychedelics, but in a good way, certainly in a good way. But I was thinking about Lorenzo, if you know these books of Robert A. Monroe, an American TV producer who he wrote 3 books, one called Journeys Out of the Body. The next one was called Far Journeys, and then there was The Ultimate Journey. And he kind of, I mean, he was an example of this kind of self-initiation where things just spontaneously happened to him. And he had these experiences of being conscious when he was leaving his body. That is, in sleep, he was fully conscious. And so he spent his life kind of exploring this spiritual realm that he unknowingly entered into. And it was kind of in particular in the beginning, there was no principles. He didn't understand what was going on. So it's kind of a phenomenological description of what he encountered in this state. And I remember, it's many years since I read these books, but I remember in the first book, there were 2 beings, he just called them A and B, that kind of lost track of each other. So they were on some kind of excursion into the spatio-temporal dimension. That's how it was described. But the funny thing about it is that it turns out later on that A and B are actually the same person, but at different times, and they actually have some kind of interaction. So I can't remember if A is the future self and B the present, or the other way around. But I think it's in the second book, certainly you're seeing the same situation from the perspective of the future person, you could say. And it turns out it's Robert A. Monroe himself that there are these. So there's in this realm, in the spiritual realm, there's somehow this. I think about it as some kind of ability to play around with perspective in both time and space. And I think I agree with Matt that there must be some kind of fluidity there, that things cannot just be fixed, but there's an interaction going on, not only relationally in space, but also in time. And at some point, he meets some higher beings, higher initiates of some kind, and he come into this speculation that maybe what he's meeting there is just another future version, a virtual, you could say, future version of himself, going back in time to meet him and help him in some ways. And also it turns out that he, at some point, he experiences that he's actually part of some kind of cluster, I think is the expression that he uses. So there's a cluster of beings, whether Robert M. Monroe, who's the writer of this book, is just one being in this cluster of beings that perhaps exist across also the timeline somehow. So I think you're touching on something that also I think this Danish writer I'm very inspired by, Martinus, he described how he could travel in perspective, so he could kind of travel into the microcosm. So he had this ability, and also he could travel upwards into the macrocosm, and he could change this intuitive faculty that he gained somehow allowed him to have this shift in perspective. And actually, many years ago, I experienced the same kind of thing, that I was sitting. I had some kind of self-initiation happening to me when I was 25 years old, and I didn't know what was going on. And one of the things that came to me in this, when it had recently happened, is that one day I was sitting reading this Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He has a book called Sickness Unto Death, and he asked this question: what is the self? And then he gives an answer that was completely incomprehensible to me. So I was just sitting there with this question: what is the self? And then I was looking out into the room, and suddenly I found out spontaneously I could shift the perspective. I could kind of zoom in on objects, and I could zoom out. And I started playing around with it, zooming in, zooming out, and experienced that something was changing in the whole atmosphere, and the room was kind of dissolving into light. And at some point, I started feeling like I was falling, as in an elevator going downwards. And then I became afraid. I became frightened simply. And then the whole experience stopped immediately. So fear was kind of the blocking stone, you could say. And for a while, I played a little around with it, but every time I encountered this fear, so eventually I just stopped. I thought, well, I'm not there yet. I'm not mature to play around with this thing. I have matured enough to play around with this thing. But I kind of got the sense that we're on the edge of something where we gain this ability to play around with perspective in space and in time. So we can travel in space and we can travel in time. I think that's going to happen sometime when we've matured enough. Now, that's one thing, but there's another thing. Maybe I read a little too long, because I read until page 260. I think you stopped your resume a little before that. But on page 260, he's saying something else about this. So he's talking about thought pictures that belong to everyday life, whose purpose is to portray some external object. So there's a thought picture in everyday life. It should correspond to some kind of external object. But when we experience structures in this spiritual state, then the kind of measure of the image is not how well it corresponds to something in the spiritual world, because it's a symbol. So he's talking about at the bottom of the page, it's for this reason that symbolic thought pictures do better than those that depict external objects or activities, for the latter have their point of support in the external world, so that the soul is not driven to rely upon itself alone, as in the case with the symbolic thought pictures, which have been built up by the soul's own exertions. So there's something about symbols that do not depict or portray something, but they have some kind of, they have another role to play, so to speak. And I think in building on what Angus said, I think we can bring this ability to view things as symbols into our everyday life experience as well. So if somehow we have this change of consciousness, it's not only that we can experience things in the spiritual world, say, by the soul's own exertions, but we can also come to a point perhaps where when we look into the world, like in Goethe's phenomenological experiments and observations and so on, when he comes upon this idea of the Urpflanz or the Urphänomen, I think it's obvious that he's bringing this spiritual capacity into everyday life and looking at the world around him as symbols, and not only seeing that which is being depicted, but also that which is being pointed to somehow in the spiritual realm.
Yeah, thank you, Karsten. Just makes me think that, so much of our experience is conditioned by habitual responses to sensory impressions. And that part of this process of developing clairvoyance and the process of initiation is generating our own meanings, as you're suggesting, instead of just habitually allowing the physical world and our physical body's responses to certain impressions to drive our behavior and our imagination, to free the imagination from that kind of habitual responsiveness, so that the eye can begin to generate the meaning, the symbols, the imagery freely. Yeah, to navigate space and time in the way that you're describing. Yeah. Angus, please, and then Ashton.
Yeah, I'm going to try and get you to tell us more about Whitehead, as like with thoughts, or a couple of thoughts related to your phrase "destiny is a thing," is what you said. If we read, this is also from GA 182. One of the strange things Steiner does, he defines atheism or godlessness, non-belief in God, as a physical sickness. And this is particularly interesting because he's indicating that it's actually, we are too rooted in our body, and there's a corruption of the body which actually impedes us from being able to believe in God. He also he talks about a lot of other interesting things there, but why that is important to one of the things that I think is happening in our conversation here is because, and this links to what you just said immediately before, Matt, that one of the many ways of understanding what Christ performed on earth, it was actually a maintaining of individual awareness. It's like after death. It's full eye consciousness after death, indicating that this a freeing of oneself from. So this eye experience is no longer bound to the physical body. It is completely independent of the body. And I was looking desperately, I didn't actually find it, but Steiner says something almost identical in Philosophy of Freedom, where he says, it's like at some stage you arrive, it's like once you have gained, it's like eye consciousness, spiritual eye consciousness through an observation of your thinking, through the exceptional state, then the body has performed its function, and you are no longer dependent on it for your eye consciousness. And this is all related to this awareness of the spiritual world entering in upon us. So this destiny is a thing, is that this is a liberating, as you were saying, Matt, ourselves from being tied. Some people might use a more emotive way, like imprisoned in our bodies, but it's a temple also, where we have to learn something and then become free. But in Theosophy, GA9, he has a very interesting observation comparing memory with deeds. And he says, if you think of memory, what happens is impressions of the world, Like, so they as long as we're awake, it's like they make an impression on us, and then later on we can call them to mind. The world sort of like leaves its impressions in us, and spontaneously we might be somewhere else, and this memory pops up. And it says our deeds are the mirror action of that. And so the example he gives in Theosophy, he says, like, if you're walking through the woods and you snap a branch on a tree, your action, your deed, your will has created something that will have effects. It's like throughout, it's like the rest of history. We don't know what they are, but it's inevitable that you have caused something to happen in the world. And what he posits is in the same way that memories come back to us, our deeds come back to us as individual I beings. So that which we have set in motion, we will continue to be linked to it. And you've got this breathing process that Max mentioned. There's like impressions from the outside world into memory, and so the spiritual world. You use this term to I generated. I see the I more as the portal through which the spiritual impulses can flow through us, as opposed to specifically what generates it. But that's just like my own preference. But these spiritual impulses, which Steiner talks more thoroughly about in 11 and 12 of Philosophy of Freedom, they are acting through us. They manifest themselves in deeds, and we are attached to them in the same way. I'd love to hear if you can link any of that to your thoughts with Whitehead, because it sounded really interesting what you mentioned at the end there.
Yeah, I might have to do a pop-up to link it to Whitehead, because I need to introduce Whitehead's whole theology for it to fully sink in. But yeah, just the idea that our deeds leave a trace. I mean, that's karma, right? That's the accumulation of our action in the world as it ripples out, and then of course it's going to feed back onto us, onto our own I. Maybe I'll do a pop-up on Whitehead and connect these things more closely, because it would take me more than 5 minutes to unpack it all, and it would be helpful because I do want to develop that connection between Whitehead's metaphysics and conceptual scheme and Steiner's clairvoyant perceptions and his cosmology. It's a big project, but a pop-up would help me begin to trace those thoughts out. But I want to give Ashton a chance here to chime in. Are you there, Ashton? There you go.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Sorry I can't be there with you all on camera. I'm driving through New Mexico. But I just wanted to share some thoughts in relation to the discussion around destiny and the future. I was thinking of the way in which Richard Tarnas, when he talks about, he has this little, I guess, kind of metaphysical reflection on destiny and fate at the beginning of Cosmos and Psyche. And what he insists on is that astrology is archetypally predictive. And so we can get a sense of, like, rather than an already existing future with like future beings that are influencing, or future versions of us that are influencing us from the future, that that there's a kind of archetypal qualitative causation at work that orders time. And I made the comparison to music in a prior session. Like, if you're listening to a new song and dancing to it, and there's still novelty, but you have some sense of the structure already, having listened and danced to the music for like halfway through the track, you kind of get a sense of what's coming. And also, I was listening to one of Dale's lecture recordings recently for it was a collected works 194, which has Mike IL in the title, and he said something that I thought was really interesting and related to all this. He said basically like necessity is real, but that there's many ways for it to find its manifestation. So it's not like necessity in a kind of rigid way. And I feel like that's very much connected with this, you know, Tarnas is saying that astrology provides a kind of map, or I guess a techne for archetypal prediction, but not determinative, precise, exact. Yeah, just leaves room for I liked what Lorenzo said, something like the destiny is something that is a kind of not a foil, but something to be bad up against or something like that. Anyway, and also it's just been a rich discussion so far, but I could really relate to what Karsten was saying about these experiences, kind of non-ordinary states, and then the kind of fear that closes it down, to relate to that. And Steiner also, from what I understand, does relate these higher modes of cognition, imagination, inspiration, and intuition to a kind of irradiation of, I guess, dimensions that are already, like the fourth dimension is actually two dimensions, and it's connected with the pictures of imagination. And anyway, so I'll stop there. Great to tune in for this, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. I guess that fear is the work of Ahriman, right? Trying to say, nope, you can't see that, you can't experience that. That's that Ahrimanic veil coming down. And love would be the antidote. And yeah, just briefly, thinking about destiny being a thing and fate, similar to what Rick Tarnas is saying there, as Ashton articulated it. Just to briefly lay out Whitehead's view of this, there's the primordial nature of God, which is kind of like this perfect ideal or archetypal realm of ideas where nothing is changing, it's eternal, and it's perfect. But that's only one half, you might say, of the divine nature. There's also what he calls the consequent nature of God, which is God's relationship to the world, to the process of cosmic evolution and historical unfolding. And that historical unfolding, while it doesn't change the ideal eternal perfection of the primordial nature, it enriches it. It through actualization, and this is the cycling process of what's learned through the Christ impulse in heaven comes back into the world, that I read from the final pages of Process and Reality. Through the historic process, the divine nature is enriched. It's made more concrete. It's something is learned, and so while the destiny thing is there sort of as a reality in heaven, a perfect providence, that's sort of pulling evolution toward it, but also it's what evolution proceeds out of and originally. It's not simply that all of this historic process is a stage play. No, it matters to the divine, and something, maybe this whole sevenfold planetary evolution is a divine learning process, and it's something in me resists the idea that it's just for show, or just to go through the motions. It's got to be enriching to the highest, to the Godhead on some level. That for it to be enriching, the Godhead can't know in advance how the historic process will unfold. There could be an archetypal structuring that, it will have this kind of a rhythm to it, and there's a virtual future that is, at least there are grooves that we're more likely, and that there's more probability that we will go down. But there's got to be freedom along the way, and there's got to be the possibility of even God being surprised by what unfolds. That would be the Whiteheadian view of this. And I detect resonances in Steiner. There are falls which occur, which end up being beneficial in the long run, but don't seem to have been planned by the hierarchies initially, right? And so there's some degree of contingency in this evolutionary process as I read it. But yeah, that's just a little taste of the comparison between Whitehead's theology and what Steiner's up to here. Did you want, Ashton, did your hand go back up?
Nope, I didn't put it
You
out.
in a week.
Okay. All right. That's it, everyone. We'll call it quits for today. And see you all next week for session 14, chapter 5.
Thank you.
Bye.